This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight, Dean Henderson, he's returning after a show we did last week. We're going to talk some more about his recent book, the title of Royal Bloodline, Wetiko, and the Great Remembering. Last week we talked about some of this. Who is Wetiko? We talked about the Great Remembering. Who are we as humans? Who are we really as humans? And today we're going to continue the discussion. And Dean, uh, I'm so happy to have you back on the show, but I want to talk about something tonight. We've talked about it in the past, but with everything that's going on in the world today, I think most people are angry, depressed, and maybe the majority are just confused about what is going on. In the past, I have been inclined to blame what's happened in my lifetime on the government of the United States. It's been a while now, but I no longer believe that it is Joseph Biden, George Bush, Barack Obama, or anybody else who occupies that office who really is in charge. I think the topic tonight is going to be difficult for a lot of people to wrap their arms around. You know this because you have been talking about this and researching it for decades. Let's start with the title of your book, Royal Bloodline. Let's talk about that, Dean. What do you mean when you say the royal bloodlines?
Yeah, so the world changed dramatically around 8,500 years ago when there was an intervention by the Anunnaki from planet Nibiru. This is well documented in the Sumerian clay tablets, which are the oldest form of human language, the cuneiform language. Um, Sumeria, of course, is Mesopotamia. It's also modern day Iraq. And so, according to these tablets, which many of which were destroyed or buried in the mud in the estuary of the Tigris and Euphrates River, talk about these Anunnaki and how they came to Samaria and they were looking for gold to patch their ozone layer around the planet Nibiru because it was depleted. Something that actually NASA has done on this planet to deal with our depleted ozone layer using gold flecking to patch it. And we talk about the leaders, Anki and Enlil. They talk about how the Sumerians were forced into agriculture from a hunting and gathering existence, which at that time on Earth was the only mode of living, hunting, gathering, foraging, um, not living a sedentary life, but living a nomadic or a semi nomadic life. And for hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived this way. So these tablets talk about it's basically an intervention by these people, how they then manipulated the DNA of people and animals to create a slave class, um, which was used to mine gold. Primarily, it looks like in South Africa, which is also still today the primary gold mining center of the world. Um, and we had our first king, and his name was King Sargon. And so and he was followed by King Marduk, and these were Anunnaki. This was the beginning of the royal bloodline that I'm talking about. Before that, on this earth, we didn't have kings and queens. We didn't have dukes and sirs and prince and princesses, barons, baronesses, titled people. So anytime you see a titled person, they're connected to this royal bloodline. And King Sargon was the first, and then King Marduk set out to the Indus Valley to conquer that area shortly after their arrival, and he enslaved those people into agriculture. And this bloodline just spread out across the planet. King Nebuchadnezzar was another one. They spread out across the planet, and they literally enslaved the people, building these giant temples like Tikal or Angkor Wat or uh, any number of Machu Picchu, any number of these, any of these temples that we now just can't seem to explain. How did they build these? How was it done? Can't really be explained using current human scientific methods. And so they did have some very interesting technology already. They knew how to manipulate DNA. They knew how to probably levitate objects using anti-gravity technology, and which explains these giant stones that were put into place in different areas. And from there, this bloodline, pretty much, like I say, enslaved the people into agriculture so that they could then administer the cities. Before this, there was no cities. The concept of a city was something that was not in existence at this time. So people lived in a dispersed manner in small clans and tribes and villages. And again, they moved from place to place with the seasons, with the game, with the sea mammals, the fish, and they followed the animals and the different seasons where the plants were growing. And so cities sprang up. The first were Ur and Babylon. And all of these old ancient cities in the Middle East were administered by the Anunnaki bloodline and fed and built. And, the heavy lifting was done by the humans who were in these areas. So from there, from Samaria, they branched out and they went two directions. Some went to Babylon, which is now current Baghdad, and very very near Samaria, and they set up the Babylonian Empire. And others went to Egypt and became the pharaohs. And so the pharaohs were direct descendants of the Anunnaki as well, which explains why they had these cone-shaped heads, these elongated skulls. Now we're finding all these elongated skulls in the world, buried in different places, and these are the Anunnaki. And so
Dean,
throughout
let me interrupt you for a minute because I want to establish something. People listening to this, and I've tried to recount this on my own, and people said, wait a minute, how do you know this? Now you're talking about these Sumerian clay tablets that were discovered that contained stories that you're talking about right now of the Anunnaki, an alien race that came here from the planet Nibiru. It's all written on these tablets. So this is not something that's being made up. Now, who is it, Dean? I know it's not you that has found these tablets, that has been able to translate them, but it's a whole group of people now, from ancient historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, physicists, astronomers, and linguists have all been studying these tablets. Explain to me a little bit more in our audience who these people are, and is what they're studying a new science, or what is it? I think it's important to establish this for
sure,
lay people who are just saying, wait a minute, wait a minute, who made this stuff up? To tell me more about that.
sure. Um, well, it was Zechariah Sitchin who really got the ball rolling. He was an Azerbaijani, and he was able to translate the Sumerian cuneiform into English, and others have followed him and confirmed his findings. And it is part of what I guess you'd call the new science. It's just like, another example of the new science is for eons. We thought that there were three elements or three states of matter on this earth. There was gas, liquid, and solids, right? And so now, even at South Dakota School of Mines, probably the best engineering school in the United States. My nephew just went there and he confirmed this. I asked him, I said, "Do they teach plasma physics?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "So they're now teaching that plasma is the fourth state of matter." So there's all kinds of exciting things going on with this new science and different fields, different areas, different, but it's all, well researched. And of course it takes a lot of confirmation and a lot of arduous and rigorous critiques to come to these conclusions. So yes, this absolutely is not something that I just pulled out of my hat and decided to throw out there. But the thing is, when you start looking at Sitchin's research and you start looking at the events that have followed, for example, the Iraq War occurred at actually the time in the 1990s when Sitchin's work finally was being taken seriously, because for years they thought this stuff, and not just in the case of Samaria, but in the case of native people everywhere, the sort of Anglophile scientific establishment would just say, well, these are just stories, these are just myths, they don't mean anything, and we can write something down in history books and it's absolute concrete logic, da da da. But when indigenous people write it down, somehow it has to be taken as myth, right? It can't be, well, that's just garbage, that's just a bias, that's just colonial, neo-colonial think, where you think you're smarter than black people, which of course they did and some still do. And so now these things are actually being literally translated and taken as okay, that's really what they meant. It wasn't just these stories they were making up and stuff like that. So in 1990s, Iraq was sort of roped off to the world because of the Iraq War, right? And the epicenter of the findings that we're talking about existed in the Basra region. So almost immediately, the British, not the Americans, the British took over the Basra area, and British Petroleum established itself as the oil, and still is the oil giant in Basra. It took over that whole area. And so it sealed off research of these cuneiform tablets to the increasing number of researchers who were interested to find the truth and to find out, well, what's actually the deal here? What is this real? I mean, this is a huge discovery because it changes everything about the origin of man. It changes all of our preconceptions about where we came from. And so when we went into Iraq, when U.S. troops went into Iraq, the very first thing they did was what? They didn't go to the central bank first. They went there second. That's the second place they went, was to privatize and seize and take control of the nationalized assets of the Iraqi people and put it under Rothschild's central bank control. No, they went to the museum. They went to the museum. Everybody remembers it. And they ransacked the museum, and they said there was these looters, but it wasn't looters. It was official intelligence people who were taking out all of these tablets, taking out all of these carvings and these statues and all this evidence of these Anunnaki that had come to that area, because that museum at that time was the primary place where researchers were taking their findings. And obviously, being in Iraq, being in the area of Babylon and Samaria that would belong to the Iraqi people as their part of their history. So all that was looted, ransacked. It was spread all across Europe into the museums of the Bloodline, because that's where the Bloodline lives now. And so that's kind of a little bit of background on that. But so yeah, it's definitely it's controversial, obviously. It's revolutionary. It's a different understanding of our history. Um, and the other question to ask yourself is, well, okay, there's this line of history, and then what evidence is there of this other line of history that we're taught? Well, here's the evidence. Um, we're taught to believe that we came from apes, that we're primary, directly descended from the great apes. The great apes being chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, right? And so this all kind of, I took a lot of cultural anthropology in college back in the 80s. So I followed this whole thing, and I followed the controversy, and there was a lot of controversy, which the general public doesn't really understand this either, because what they came up with, the closest thing they ever came up with was this thing called Ramapithecus. That was supposed to be the link between humans and apes. And after closer scrutiny during the 90s and the early 2000s, the people who were pushing this theory, and it was still a theory, just like mine's a theory. It's all theory. We don't know. Okay, so but after pushing this theory for 3-4 decades, they finally threw in the towel and said, no, we don't have any solid evidence that there's any link between humans and apes. Any. So that's where modern science sits. That's where the current state of anthropology is. Is that no, there actually has not been established a connection between humans and apes. Now, it's a similar story with a lot of science, that we're taught is solid and concrete, and it's really not the case. If you get to the intellectual corridors of these universities, the people studying this stuff will tell you just what I said, mostly. Now, there's a few establishment crown people who are just, they're set in it. But again, the average person won't know this. And just like the average person has not been exposed to the Anunnaki theory that I'm positing. So, yeah.
So, Dean, you've mentioned a couple of things that I think are really important, have not been talked much about, and one of the things you just mentioned was completely new to me. I do remember during the Iraq War that the museums in Iraq were looted. And I felt, well, this is just what's happened throughout history. Well, a conquest with whoever's the conqueror is stealing money, resources, and artifacts, museum artifacts.
Mhm.
And when you just mentioned that I was going to ask, where were these Sumerian clay tablets located? You answered the question. They were in Iraq. They were in the museums, and they had been studied by these credible researchers from Zechariah Sitchin to the present day, well, at least to that time. Now, Dean, I'm thinking in my head, why were these tablets stolen and hidden away in other royal bloodline museums?
Mhm.
The answer seems to be they didn't want this knowledge to be known.
Mhm.
Am I correct in thinking that?
Absolutely. I mean, that just makes sense. And, as I say, after this region was conquered, these same Anunnaki bloodline people, and this remains to this day one bloodline. So they then went and became the pharaohs. So the interesting thing is, the pharaohs ruled Egypt with an iron hand. They were not Egyptians. They did not speak Arabic. They could not communicate with the local population. The Babylonians, the same. So you have this whole family of languages that also sprang up around 8500 BC that nobody could understand. And these were called what? They were called the Semitic languages, right? These were the Semitic languages. They couldn't understand them. And it was spoken by the Rodanites, by the Hittites, the tribe of Dan, all of these groups associated with the bloodline, Anunnaki or Anunnaki hybrid bloodlines, and the local populations in Samaria and then Egypt and then later other places could not understand. So it was a colonial language. In fact, Yiddish was one of these languages. Yiddish has nothing to do with Jewish or anything. It was just a Semitic language that nobody could understand. So these languages were used to trick the local population, to conceal information from them, and to control them. And Yiddish was used on the Silk Road. I mean, that was the primary language because the Silk Road trade was administered by the Li family, which is an Anunnaki bloodline that originated in Samaria in China, and they established the Tang dynasty in China. On the other side of the Silk Road, you had the Rhodonite bankers led by the Baccarat family. The Baccarats later became the Bowers and then later became the Rothschilds. And they administered the Silk Road trade on the western side of the pass, the Khyber Pass. And so these languages, these Semitic languages just sprang up out of nowhere. So when somebody says you're anti-Semitic, and you can look this up in any dictionary, that's what Semitic means. It's a family of languages. It's not Jewish. It's just a family of languages. Look it up in the dictionary right now. And so when they say we're anti-Semitic, it doesn't make sense. You can't be against Jews and at the same time be anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitic means you're against a family of languages, which I guess I am, because these languages were used to confuse people, and they were used by the crown as a control mechanism of local population. So then we go to Egypt, and this tyranny continues, and they enslave the local population, and there's uprisings, many uprisings, especially towards the end of the Egyptian Empire. Finally, they overthrow Cleopatra the Seventh, who was the last Egyptian pharaoh. She actually did learn some Arabic. She was the only one that ever did. This was around, I believe, 68 BC. She was deposed finally in a revolution in Cairo by the people who were just sick and tired of the pharaohs and their colonizing of them and their usury and their exploitation of the local people. So they overthrew the pharaohs. That's another thing people don't know. They just think, oh, the pharaohs just disappeared. No, they were overthrown. They were overthrown by the local population. So Cleopatra then had an affair with who? With Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And with Julius Caesar, they had a son. The son's name was Caesarion, which is also interesting because if she's an Anunnaki, and maybe there was a problem with the birth. I don't know, but that word Caesarion, Caesarian section is used to describe when a woman has to have her abdomen opened up to have a baby. So on the way out of there, she's having an affair with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was one of the founders of the Holy Roman Empire. And so what does Julius Caesar do? He one of the things he does on the way, the bloodline moving from Cairo across the Mediterranean into Rome, just moving. It didn't end. The Egyptian Empire wasn't defeated. It didn't end. It just moved. And what was the thing that Julius Caesar did on the way out? He burned the Alexandria Library. This is a common knowledge. Everyone is pretty much consensus. Yes, it was Julius Caesar that burned down the Alexandria Library, which at that time was the repository of many, many, many important documents about the history of the world, the human history especially, before that time. And again, why do they do that? The same reason they stole the tablets from the museum in Baghdad. They are erasing history. They're erasing their dirty deeds, their colonialism, their conquering, their rape, their pillage, and their exploitation of the people. And they want us to believe that it's a clean slate, and the Holy Roman Empire just poof, it just popped up out of nowhere. It has nothing to do with the pharaohs, has nothing to do with the Sumerian Anunnaki or the Babylonians, right? Right. So then when the Holy Roman Empire winds down, already Londinium was part of that. London. It's called Londinium. And by the first century AD, Londinium was an important part of the Holy Roman Empire. Um, Mainly because of its location. It was at the far reach of the empire. And then later, when ships became a big thing in the 14th, 15th century, of course, that was at the edge of your seafaring routes going to the New World, and and shipbuilding, in fact, did spring up just outside the city of London. That became the epicenter of shipbuilding in the 1540s or something. So within 9 years of the Holy Roman Empire officially dissolving came Pax Britannica, the British Empire. So again, the Holy Roman Empire did not die. It wasn't vanquished. They plant these myths about, oh yeah, that's what happens when you act like this, your empire falls. And it never fell. It didn't fall. It just, these bloodlines that controlled it, that controlled Egypt, that controlled Samaria before that controlled Babylon, the Silk Road trade, that controlled China, that controlled the agriculture in the Indus Valley, they simply moved their headquarters to the city of London, and it became the British Empire. Then, after American independence and especially after Bretton Woods agreements in World War II, again, we're taught to believe that the British Empire just went away and the United States became the empire, and we, the people of the United States, were the bad guys, and it was us that did it. And no, again, it's just, they relocated not so much their financial and political wing, but their military wing to the United States. So we are essentially a Hessianized mercenary force for the bloodline, which operates geopolitically from the city of London and financially from the Swiss Alps. And that's how it works today. But again, it's one of the things I really I was floored. I mean, because I've had these inclinations, I've had a lot of sort of some evidence, but not much that these things, that this was how it was. But after researching this book, I can tell you that this is how it is, and that this is what happened, and that this timeline from the original King Sargon, the first king in the world, to the current King Charles, is a seamless transition, and all of these Anunnaki bloodlines, the only thing they really did was they just changed their zip code for their headquarters. But they continued, of course, to colonize the entire planet. And as they got the ships, and then as they got the technology, which they have now, they have conquered the entire planet. They own the entire planet. It's not an exaggeration. They own BlackRock and Vanguard in this country, in the United States, which, if you look at the Fortune 500 corporations, who's the owners? Every single one of them, the top two owners, are BlackRock and Vanguard. And then Vanguard, which is private, so you can't research it easily, owns BlackRock, owns it. And then there's a State Street Capital, which is, again, controlled by the bloodline through the Boston Brahmins, they call them, the East Coast, the Eastern Seaboard people who facilitate the Crown's colonialism of this country. The Perkins family, the Sutherland family, the Forbes family, people like this. And then FMR Corporation is the fourth one that always shows up, Fidelity Management and Resources. So Mellon, Bank of New York Mellon is another one, probably usually the fifth, but sometimes the sixth. There'll be, they start mixing it up. But the first two are always Vanguard and BlackRock. And if you look at other countries, if you look at the whole world, they literally own the whole world. And it just, the more I research into this stuff, and I've been at it for 40 years now, the more solid it gets, and the worse it gets, because people think, oh, this can't be true. And when I first started down this path, yeah, this can't be true. It's true, and it's worse than we think. It's actually much worse than we think, as far as to the extent that this one bloodline, and I would call it, if I had to pick a name, I would call it the Habsburg bloodline, because that's as far back as I can find Constantine the Great was a Habsburg. Okay, he's the guy that convened the Council of Nicaea, which pretty much took Jesus' Catholic Church and destroyed it. They started to say things like, Jesus is your Messiah. Jesus never wanted to be a Messiah. Jesus wanted to be an example, and he wanted his apostles to be examples. And he put the responsibility on them to go out and show people how to live, not tell people how to live, but show people, not get up on a pedestal and say, I'm the supreme leader, follow me. No, this is all Anunnaki think. This is not human think. So they destroyed that. They said Jesus is a Messiah now at the Council of Nicaea. They also said, let's celebrate Easter. Yeah, let's celebrate the murder of Jesus. So you talk about inversion right off the bat. And I grew up Catholic. I've always was bothered, even as a little kid. I was always like, why is this Good Friday? What's good about this? I don't understand. I don't understand. So they wrecked the Catholic Church, and then they took it over. And the Holy Roman Empire, of course, made it its base. Peter had established the Roman Catholic Church, not the Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic Church in Turkey, out in the middle of the desert. Very simple compound. And Peter was the rock. That's who Jesus said, build my church on Peter, the rock. So they went to Turkey, started it the right way. And within 200 years, they had taken it, usurped it, moved it to Rome, part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was just getting going. And so Constantine the Great, who convened all that, was a Habsburg. Charlemagne was a Habsburg. Charlemagne, one of the first tyrants to run medieval Europe. Every single U.S. president, I believe, except Ronald Reagan, and I'm not sure about Trump, is related to the Charlemagne bloodline. Is a part of the Charlemagne bloodline. So if I had to put a name on it, it's Habsburg. And they're the ones apparently who control or who have the spear of destiny, which was used to kill Jesus on the cross, in their castle in Belgium. And they gave it to Hitler during World War II to give him some extra power, black magic, whatever they do. And then they gave it to Klaus Schwab to run the World Economic Forum and try to take us into this fourth industrial dystopian revolution that they're working on, but which is actually failing. So these are very powerful, and they probably, it's as good a name as any to use to describe it. But there's many names that are part of this bloodline. They've changed their names over the year. They've also interbred with the human population to conceal their elongated skulls, to conceal they're obviously did not look like humans at first, but they were smart and crafty, and so they've interbred with the human population, and they've been able to conceal themselves behind this. But one thing to add is, if you look at Prince William, just check him out, because this is going to be the next king, not just maybe of England, but of the world, if they have their way, because their plan is to establish this third temple in Jerusalem, bring back a fake Antichrist, bring back a fake Messiah, which I think is going to be, Prince William. And he has an elongated skull. I don't care what anybody says. Just look at him. Use your head. Use your eyes. You have eyes to see. Then there it is. So that's the thing. You start with a theory. You start with, well, that's interesting. Sitchin. Oh, that's interesting. And then you start filling in the dots, and you start corroborating evidence, and you start establishing this timeline, and it all starts to kind of fit together, and that's science.
All right. I have, for a number of years, believed this basic line that you've been talking about. We've talked about that before. I discovered Zecharia Sitchin over 30 years ago and read all of his books, then discovered you maybe a decade ago and started reading your books. And tonight you filled in a number of gaps for me. I want to focus now. You keep using the word the crown, and then you're using the term royal bloodlines. And just now you said they've even intermingled with humans. So, how many crowns are there? I mean, there are a lot of kings. There still are kings in the world today. You know, from Portugal to Spain, all the way over to Denmark and the Netherlands. There have been kings. Um, there have been kings in, I guess, China. You talked about a royal bloodline in China. Who's at the top of that line? Who's the most pure? Who has the purest sang real, the royal blood? Who's got it? Is it London?
No. I mean, most of these, I mean, most of these bloodline people, if I had to put a number on, like, where do they live? I think probably Italy has the most of them. The Alps have a lot. The UK has a lot. But the important thing to understand is that, okay, there's one crown. There's just one crown, okay? So, for example, the Habsburg dynasty, if you look throughout Europe, they must run, I don't know what they run anymore, Austria, Hungary, um, Belgium, I think, is a Habsburg family name crown. That they do run a lot of sort of Central Europe. The Bourbon family, Portugal, Spain, kind of Southern Europe. But again, you have to remember, this is the same bloodline. This is really the same family. It's just they've changed names. Just like when Chevron merged with Texaco, right? They don't call it Chevron Texaco. Why not? Because they don't want you to remember how concentrated the wealth is. So now they just call it Chevron. For some reason they still call ExxonMobil. Maybe they're just throwing that in our face. I don't know, but this is how they do with corporations, which they own. They in fact invented the idea of a corporation, where you could separate responsibility from the individual and put it under a corporation, because the crown doesn't accept any responsibility. They're sovereign. The crown is sovereign, so they claim sovereignty. So they can travel without a passport anywhere. They can own Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, South African rand. They can own any currency. They can do anything. We can't do any of that. Try to start a bank account overseas, as an American. You can't do it. Try to trade in a currency. You can't do it. I mean, you can go through a broker to do it because they're the brokers, but they can do anything they want. They're sovereign, so they don't have a country. This is the important thing to understand about the crown, which is the one bloodline. The one bloodline. It's all related. That's all. All these crown heads of Europe are related. And Charlie, he's from the Plantagenet clan, and the Tudors and the Windsors. Again, it's the same family as the Habsburg. It's the same family as the Bourbons. It's the same family as the Franks, who were the kings of France, the Merovingians. It's the same family as the Rollos, who were the Vikings, and who are now the bloodlines that control Denmark and Norway and Northern Europe. Same bloodline as the Li family that controls China, still does. It's still the wealthiest family by far in China. Same bloodline as the Shah family, which controlled the Palavicinis, which controlled the Iranian empire, the Persian Empire. Same bloodline as the Singh family, which is the Sikhs. Any Sikh is a Singh, last name Singh. Very powerful family in India. Same bloodline as the Khan family, Khan, which controls Pakistan, Afghanistan, also India, Northern India. The Aga Khan Foundation works for the British intelligence to train every single jihadi, mujahideen, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, create all those crazy fake Islamists who attack real Muslims, attack good people on behalf of the crown. So these families are all related. They're all the same bloodline. The crown has no country. The crown is sovereign. The crown exists. This is why the idea of offshore banking. So offshore banking occurs only out of the city of London. It's administered 100%, every single offshore banking place, whether it's, Bahamas, Bermuda, Vanuatu, Cayman Islands, Liberia, wherever it is, whatever it is, it's just a flag on a little building somewhere, and it's administered by the Bank of England out of the City of London by the sovereign crown. The only people who are able to do this. We can't do this. If you try to start an offshore bank account, the IRS will come after you and just destroy you. But they do it, and that's how they hide. That's how they hide their enormous wealth, so that people are confused and they somehow think, oh yeah, Bill Gates is the richest guy. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. Yeah, he's not even close. He has nothing compared to these people. Rothschilds control $100 trillion, just the Rothschilds, which is, again, it's the same bloodline, the same family. The Rothschilds happen to specialize in banking, accounting, keeping track of the money. So they're the most famous. They're also the Red Shield, Rothschild, Red Shield, bloodline shield the bloodline. So they take the heat. If you get past, oh, the U.S. runs the world. And then if you get past, oh, Israel's the problem. And then if you get past, oh, no, it's the City of London, they're still the bloodline shield. and you'll start blaming the Rothschilds for everything. And that's fine. They take it. That's their job. The Red Shield, that's their job. So nobody really gets past that. I mean, hardly anyone in the planet is, I don't know, not very many people ever get past the Rothschilds because it's a Red Shield. It's the bloodline shield. It's their final line of defense against researchers who want to find out the truth. So they are the Red Shield, and they shield the bloodline, the one bloodline, the crown, from more intense criticism. And then people just say, oh yeah, it's all the Rothschilds, and they quit researching. They stop. But we can't stop. We have to keep going. And by the way, I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg here, Regis. I need help. I need other people to take this up. And some are. And we are finding out stuff that, and it all makes sense. I mean, it's like a puzzle. And when you get to the end, it just more and more, you go faster and faster. Oh, yeah. Because it all starts making sense. But no, they're sovereign. They administer geopolitically from the City of London, the offshore banking, the City of London. They store their wealth primarily at the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, which is the central bank for central banks. So the Federal Reserve is a subsidiary of the Bank of International Settlements. The Bank of England is a subsidiary of that. The Bank of France, the Bank of Australia, the Bank of Canada, all of which are owned by the same bloodline. But this is their central bank of central banks. So if, really crazy stuff happens in the world, that's literally the lender of last resorts, because they control the wealth, they control the money. And then again, the U.S. is a military wing that protects that wealth. They don't care. They could use China in the same way. And someday, I predict they will, maybe someday soon, they'll just throw the U.S. overboard, crash the dollar, and get behind the Chinese. That's what they do. They use Israel as a geopolitical control mechanism of the Middle East, because they want to keep the Muslims divided, and they want to keep the oil flowing to the Western corporations. They're not, I shouldn't say Western, I should say Crown corporations, the four horsemen of banking that I described in my very first book, Big Oil and Their Bankers. And that would be Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, and Chevron Texaco. And the same people who are looking at the oil and gas off of Gaza, the same people who are, own Genie Oil, which is trying to build a pipeline through Syria so that all the bars to oil that Iran and Qatar split, and the Pars 1 and Pars 2 oil fields in the Persian Gulf, they want it all to go to Europe. Iran wants it all to go to Central Asia and Russia and China. And so they're building this, Genie Oil is building this pipeline through the Golan Heights. And so even this thing in Israel, it has everything to do with resources, everything to do with global control by the crown. They want to control everything. And pipelines are a big deal because, pipelines carry energy, carry oil. That's why they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. They don't want Russian oil or natural gas coming into Europe. They want the crown oil coming into Europe. And, Russia used to have its own bloodline, the Romanovs, and they were deposed. And the Romanovs, again, are part of this bloodline. The Pallavicinis are part of it. Um, the Glucksbergs are part of it. They're a Norwegian bunch. The Algobrandinis, the Massimos, the De Medicis, the Bancos. There's all kinds of names for this bloodline. And interestingly, in Normandy, in about the 15th century again, Normandy, there was this big congregation of the bloodline, and they came together in this region of southern France, and they sort of did this eugenics thing where, they interbred, maybe to reinforce the bloodline at that point because they'd been interbreeding with humans, so they needed to reinforce their own Anunnaki blood. So they came together in Normandy and they interbred, and out of that came William the Conqueror. And William the Conqueror set out and then took over the British Isles and established what? The United Kingdom. There it is. There it is. The United Kingdom. So in other words, this would be going forward their base of operations. And why? Because it's an island, because it's got a rocky coastline. At that time, they had the only ships, the Knights Templar, who never worked for the Catholic Church, by the way. They've always worked for the bloodline. They started out, King Baldwin, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They took it over. They stole it from the Muslims. They didn't build anything. All this stuff about, the Masons are the great builders. And no, they steal stuff. They don't build anything. They steal stuff. They exploit people. They don't know how to build anything. So King Baldwin put the Templars in his Temple Mount headquarters that they stole from the Saracen Muslims who had built it. And that was the beginnings of the Knights Templar, not as a Catholic Crusader army, no, as a crown Crusader army. This is a huge piece of history that's always distorted because, they want to hide. So they hid behind the Catholics, destroyed the Catholic Church, hid behind the Protestants, destroyed the Protestant churches with all their crazy evangelical branches that are now controlled by the CIA. And again, tell you Jesus is a Messiah. You don't have to worry. You can sin all you want. And you'll still go to heaven. All you got to say is Jesus is my Savior. And now they're hiding behind science. So when William the Conqueror took over the UK, the money started flowing in that direction, and all the Templar loot and all that money that was hidden in the throughout the world, but mostly in the Roman Empire, started to migrate towards Scotland. And then the Sinclair family, or the St. Clair family, the biggest radio broadcasting corporation in the United States is Sinclair Broadcasting. And they put out garbage. And they own most of the radio stations in this country anymore. So they control the media. Control of the media is very important, obviously. So then that money under William III started to flow into London. They'd signed the Magna Carta. It said, this is going to liberate the people. No, the Magna Carta was just pretty much another control mechanism. It allowed the bloodline to sort of, filter into the population of landed gentry, and they became the same. And they all, it was signed on Lombard Street, Magna Carta, Lombard Street in the city of London, named after the Lombard family, one of the Venetian banking families. And this established the City of London. So the City of London, from that point forward, became this repository. And then William III, when he took over, he invited the Masons in. So all that money that they were hiding in Scotland with help from the St. Clair family came into the City of London, this huge amount of money. And from that point forward, they threw all religious pretense aside and they said, we're going to hide behind science now. And so that's when they started the Royal Societies in the 1600s. And that's when they started the East India Company in the 1600s. And now they had their base camp. Now they could switch from the Holy Roman Empire to the British Empire. And they could, they had ships now. They had big ships now. So the entire slave trade was run by two companies. The Royal Africa Company, which was 100% owned by King James I. So it was a total crown operation. That was the biggest by far. They held the most slaves by far, and it was totally controlled by the crown. So the crown ran slavery. It's clear. Want reparations? Okay, give me some too. I'm all for it. Everybody should get reparations from the crown. But it's not white people versus black people. It's not this garbage, this woke garbage, this misdirection garbage, this Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, is run by a Khan. Her name is Khan. Her last name is Khan, and she runs Black Lives Matter. So it's a misdirection operation. The second company that ran the slaves was the East India Company, and they were taking slaves from Mozambique to their plantations in Indonesia, where they were getting all the spices, because the Spice Islands, because that was one of the first things that they were bringing back, colonizing into the UK and into Europe, into the markets of Europe. So they were taking Mozambican slaves to the Indonesian plantations and the East India Company. And the East India Company, of course, ran the Opium Wars in China, along with Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which is still to this day HSBC, one of their biggest banks. The Four Horsemen of Banking: Barclays, Lloyd's of London, HSBC, Royal Bank of Scotland. As far as your City of London banks, and in the City of London, the banks vote. The bigger the bank, the more votes. So the City of London is a separate entity, you see, from the UK, and this is where all the Royal Societies are located, including the Royal Geographic Society, which continues to tell us lies about who we are as a people and where we came from, and all the other Royal Societies, the Tavistock Institute, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, which is the foreign policy think tank, which controls the Council on Foreign Relations in the U.S. and other Council on Foreign Relations in other countries, which pretty much launched the MI6, the MI5 in 1945, and then in 1947, the CIA was born, and it was planned at the same meeting as MI5 and MI6 were born. So the CIA does not work for the American people. The CIA works for the bloodline, the crown bloodline, the sovereign crown. And it protects their corporate interests, their financial interests all around the world. And so 1947, that was born. And this is really when, post-war, the Bretton Woods Agreement, right? This is really when the United States was sort of conquered for the second time, because the first time was when the Federal Reserve was born in 1913. And it was bad enough. And then we really got sucked into this crown control after World War II through the Bretton Woods Agreement. And they control our intelligence agencies. The Five Eyes Alliance, they call it, now controls the entire intelligence operation of the crown. It's administered by Serco, a contractor out of the UK, which people haven't heard of probably. It's SERCO, all capitals. You'll find a lot of times that the Crown corporations, they call them, and there is actually an official thing called the Crown Corporation. Google it. They're in every country. You'll be very interested to find out that you can find Crown corporations in like over 200 countries. And they're called Crown corporations. And that's what that means. They're controlled by this bloodline. And so Serco is one of those, and they have every single security contract in the U.S. They administer intelligence for U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, CIA, NSA, FBI. They control schools in private schools in Australia. They control prisons in New Zealand. They control the entire welfare system in the UK. It was Julian Assange was taken away in a Serco van. Serco, it says Serco on it. So they do a lot of that. They administer all the USAID money in the United States, and it's the British Crown way, contracts. So they've privatized the entire economy of the planet, and when you do that, that means contracts, and this is what vampires feed off of. So we pay our taxes to the U.S. government. The government then pays that money to contractors, to the crown, to do these things that they do, which is very little. But Serco administers a lot of the crown global activities. It's amazingly powerful. People need to check into it. It was part of RCA Corporation, which developed sonar back in the 20s, teens. At the same time, the Spanish flu occurred. Interesting. And then it split into General Electric and Serco later. But RCA Corporation was a big part of the Kennedy assassination. David Sarnoff. It's a Crown corporation. So is General Electric. Other Crown corporations are Lockheed Martin, British Aerospace, Rio Tinto, Xstrata, Glencore, Royal Dutch Shell. These are openly administered crown corporations. Also, a crown corporation called Securicom had the security contract on the World Trade Center. And it later, after the 9/11 event, it changed its name to SecuraSec. But that's also a crown corporation. They had the security contract, and Marvin Bush, George Bush's brother, was the CEO, and they mined the elevator shafts of the World Trade Centers ahead of time, closed them off, um, mined them, and they had to do it because they had the security contract. The only person could have done it. And people that worked there said, "Oh yeah, they were certain floors you couldn't go to, before that, and then there were certain other floors and certain other floors." And so this is how powerful, and people don't understand it. It's they literally ran the slave trade. They literally genocided all indigenous people, all of them. You talk about Hernando de Soto, you talk about Cortez, you talk about Columbus, you talk about all these explorers, and they were all financed by the crown, by the Bourbon family, by the Habsburgs, by the Plantagenets, by the king. The crown taught Indians here how to scalp. Indians didn't scalp anybody until the crown paid Daniel Boone and all these great explorers. Kit Carson, again, were taught these were great people. These were total scumbag mercenaries for the crown. And they'd bring back the scalps of Indians so that the crown could count them and know how many Indians they'd killed as a tactic. But also they put them up in their castles as trophies because they're sick puppies. So the power that these people have cannot really be overstated. It can only be understated, and it always is. And there's a reason for that, because we've been beat down for 8,500 years by this one crown bloodline, and they've conditioned us and taught us not to talk about them, not to mention their names, to bow before them, always bow before them, right? And it's time for humanity to get up off their knees and to take a look at what's really happening, and to just throw out all these misconceptions that the crown has put in your head through its royal societies, through your education, so-called, which is miseducation. Lose your preconceptions, because preconceptions are no good. You have to just observe, inference, conclusion. Observe, inference, conclusion. And with the phones, with the tablets, with the laptops, with the technology, nobody's observing anything. Nobody's really just observing things. This is a problem. So, of course, this is the next phase of their planned enslavement, is that you will soon observe nothing, and you can be told anything. And 6G, 7G, it's all about pretty much creating a reality that doesn't exist. It's AI. It's AI, right? So this is the next colonial project, is to take us into this world where nothing's real, where you can't tell what's real and what's not. And that's much easier done if people don't know how to observe. So first you have to distract them on the phones so they don't observe. And then you can just about do anything to them. But not me, and not you, and not people who have their humanity and are just determined to keep it, and will keep it, and will fight and struggle and resist this colonial process, this crown control, until the day we die, for sure.
Dean, it's pretty overwhelming. You're right. It's a lot worse than anybody could imagine. Um, I think that the risk that you take, the risk that I'm taking doing a show like this tonight, is to be ridiculed, scorned, laughed at, alienated. Uh, but uh, if you listen carefully, and I think as you keep saying, if you can just observe what's happening, just observe, it is really overwhelming, and it is not accidental. It is not coincidence. Uh, it's all happening according to a plan. I want to do another show with you fairly soon, Dean, because I don't want to leave people on this note of my God, there's nothing we can do, because the last part of your book is on the great remembering, and that is the answer. The great remembering, we'll go into that a lot deeper, but who are we really as human beings? What was and is our original condition? And so I look forward to having that conversation with you, Dean, real soon. Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me, Regis. Always my pleasure. Have a great one.